When Margaret Holloway opened her door that frozen February night, she had no idea she was about to break the most dangerous promise she'd ever made to herself. Never to hope again. At 53, she'd survived everything Montana could throw at her. Brutal winters, failed harvests, the death of everyone she'd ever loved. She'd built walls around her heart higher than the mountains themselves. But sometimes the fiercest storms don't just bring snow and wind. Sometimes they bring a desperate cowboy, a frightened child, and a second chance you never asked for. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this tale travels. The wind that winter cut like broken glass. Margaret Holloway stood at her kitchen window, watching the sky turn the color of old bruises. February in Montana territory was unforgiving, but this storm looked meaner than most. The clouds rolled in from the northwest, heavy and swollen, promising the kind of snow that buried fences and trapped cattle in ravines. She'd seen it before. Hell, she'd survived it before. She was good at surviving. The cabin was quiet except for the crackling of the fire and the wind testing the corners of the house, looking for weaknesses. Margaret had spent the afternoon reinforcing what she could, checking the barn, bringing in extra firewood, securing the shutters on the windows that still had glass in them. 3 windows on the north side were covered with oiled paper now. She couldn't afford glass, couldn't afford much of anything these days. She moved away from the window and stirred the pot of beans on the stove. Beans again. Beans and the last of the salted pork from the hog she'd slaughtered in November. Her stomach had stopped complaining about the monotony years ago. Food was fuel, nothing more. You ate to stay warm, to stay strong enough to work, to make it through to spring when the garden could give you something else to boil. The house felt enormous around her. It hadn't always been this way. Once this cabin had been full of noise, her husband Thomas's laugh, her son's arguments over whose turn it was to muck the stalls, the clatter of boots and dishes, and life happening in every corner. Now the silence had weight to it. It pressed down on her shoulders like a physical thing, especially at night. Thomas had been gone 11 years. Pneumonia took him in the winter of 1871, his lungs filling with fluid while she watched helplessly, spooning broth into his mouth that he couldn't swallow. Their older boy, Daniel, had died 2 years before that, kicked in the head by a spooked horse. He was 16. Their younger son, William, had made it to 18 before the typhoid got him in 76. After William, Margaret had stopped counting the ways this land could kill you. The list was too long. She'd sold off most of the acreage after William died. Couldn't work it alone, couldn't afford help. What had once been 200 acres of promise was now 40 acres of stubborn survival. She kept a small garden, a few chickens, 1 milk cow named Patience who lived up to her name by not dying despite Margaret's frequent neglect. The barn sagged a little more each year. The fences leaned. The house needed a new roof, new windows, new everything. But it was hers, and she was still breathing, and that had to count for something. Margaret was 53 years old, though most days she felt 70. Her hands were scarred and calloused, her face weathered by wind and sun into the texture of old leather. Her hair had gone gray years ago, and she kept it in a braid down her back because it was practical, not because she cared how it looked. Vanity was for women who had time for it. She wore Thomas's old shirts because they were warmer than her own, and his boots because hers had worn through. She'd stopped looking in mirrors. Love, she'd decided somewhere around her 45th birthday, was something that happened to other people. Young people. People who still believed the world owed them happiness. Margaret knew better. The world didn't owe you a damn thing. You took what you could get, you survived what you couldn't avoid, and you didn't waste time wishing for more. She'd made peace with loneliness the way you make peace with chronic pain. You acknowledge it. You live around it. You stop expecting it to go away. The wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters. The storm was coming faster than she'd thought. Margaret checked the fire, added another log, then pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The temperature was dropping. She could feel it in her bones and the old break in her left wrist from the time she'd slipped on ice carrying water from the well. Winter was settling in for the night. She was just sitting down at the table with her bowl of beans when she heard it. A sound so unexpected, so out of place, that at first she thought she'd imagined it. A knock. 3 solid raps on her front door. Margaret froze, spoon halfway to her mouth. Nobody came out here. The nearest neighbor was 6 miles away, and they barely acknowledged each other's existence. The town of Birch Creek was 12 miles to the east, and she only went there twice a year for supplies. She had no friends, no family, no reason for anyone to be standing on her porch in the middle of an incoming blizzard. The knock came again, louder this time, more urgent. Margaret set down her spoon slowly. Her heart was beating faster than it should, a flutter of something she hadn't felt in years. Not quite fear, but its close cousin. Uncertainty. She stood, wiped her hands on her apron, and crossed the room to the door. Her hand hesitated on the latch. "Who's there?" Her voice came out rougher than she intended, sharp with disuse and suspicion. "Ma'am." The voice was male, strained, muffled by the wind. "Please, I've got my boy with me. We need shelter. Storm caught us on the road." Margaret's jaw tightened. Her first instinct was to tell them to move on, find somewhere else. She didn't take in strangers, didn't want the complication, the risk, the intrusion into the carefully controlled emptiness she'd built around herself. But even as she thought it, she knew she wouldn't turn them away. Not in this weather, not with a child involved. She'd survived a lot of things, but she hadn't survived them by becoming the kind of person who let people freeze to death on her doorstep. She slid the bolt and opened the door. The wind hit her first, a brutal gust that stole her breath. Snow was already falling, fat flakes that swirled in the lamplight spilling from the cabin. And there, on her porch, stood 2 figures. The man was tall, maybe 6 feet, hunched against the wind with his arms wrapped around a small boy. He was bundled in a canvas coat crusted with ice, his hat pulled low, his face hidden in shadow. The boy, couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, was pressed against the man's chest, shivering violently. "Please," the man said again, his voice cracked. "Just for the night. We won't trouble you." Margaret stared at them for a moment longer than was kind. The wind screamed around them. The snow was falling harder now, already starting to pile against the porch railing. If she turned them away, they wouldn't make it another mile. She knew that. The storm knew that. Even the damn cow in the barn knew that. "Get inside," she said, stepping back. The man didn't hesitate. He moved past her quickly, ushering the boy ahead of him, and Margaret shut the door against the wind. The sudden silence inside the cabin was almost shocking. She turned the bolt, then turned to face her unexpected guests. In the lamplight, she could see them properly now. The man was younger than she'd expected, maybe mid-30s, though hard living had aged him the way it aged everyone out here. His face was lean and angular, all sharp lines and hollow spaces, with several days of dark stubble covering his jaw. His eyes were a pale gray-green, the color of sagebrush after rain, and they carried the kind of exhaustion that came from more than just physical labor. He pulled off his hat, revealing dark hair flecked with snow, and nodded to her. "Name's Ethan Cole," he said. "This is my son, Sam." The boy looked up at her with wide brown eyes that were trying very hard to be brave and failing. He was small for his age, thin in the way children get when meals aren't regular. His face was red from the cold, his lips tinged faintly blue. Margaret felt something twist in her chest, something she'd thought was long dead. She looked away quickly. "Margaret Holloway," she said curtly. "You can warm up by the fire. I've got beans on the stove if you're hungry." "We don't want to impose—" "You already are imposing," Margaret cut him off. "Might as well eat while you're at it." Ethan's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Yes, ma'am." She watched as he guided Sam toward the fire, helping the boy out of his wet coat. Ethan's hands were gentle, practiced. He knelt beside his son, rubbing the child's arms to warm him, murmuring something too low for Margaret to hear. Sam nodded, leaning into his father. Margaret turned away and busied herself at the stove, ladling beans into 2 more bowls. She could feel their presence in her house like a physical weight, disrupting the careful balance of her solitude. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. She wasn't used to this, wasn't used to other people's voices, other people's needs, other people's grief, because she could see it in both of them, the man and the boy. Whatever had brought them out on a night like this, it wasn't a pleasure trip. She set the bowls on the table harder than necessary. "Eat," she said. Ethan stood, guiding Sam to the table. The boy climbed onto the bench, his feet not quite touching the floor. He stared at the beans like he'd never seen food before. "Go ahead," Ethan said softly. "It's all right." Sam picked up his spoon and began to eat, slowly at first, then faster. Margaret watched him for a moment, then looked away. She knew hunger when she saw it. Ethan ate more carefully, measured bites, his eyes flicking around the cabin as if cataloging every detail. Margaret let him look. There wasn't much to see. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room. 2 bedrooms branched off the back, hers and the one that had belonged to her sons. She hadn't opened that door in years. A ladder led to a loft space where Thomas used to store tools and tack. "How far were you from town?" Margaret asked, breaking the silence. "About 8 miles when the storm hit," Ethan said. "We were trying to make it to Birch Creek. I didn't think it would come on this fast." "Storms out here don't give warnings. You should know that if you're traveling with a child." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to the bait. "You're right. I made a mistake." The easy admission surprised her. Margaret wasn't used to men who could admit fault without making excuses. "Where are you headed?" she asked. "North. There's a ranch up near Helena that's hiring. Heard they need men for the spring roundup." "Long way from here." "Yes, ma'am." "And you're traveling in February?" "Didn't have much choice." Margaret heard the weight behind those words, the story he wasn't telling. She wanted to press, wanted to know what had driven a man and his young son out into the worst time of year, but she also knew better. People out here carried their secrets close. You didn't pry unless invited. Sam had finished his beans and was slumped against his father's side, his eyes drooping. The warmth of the fire and the food in his belly were pulling him toward sleep. "Boy needs rest," Margaret said. "You both do." "We can sleep by the fire," Ethan said quickly. "We won't take your bed." "I'm not offering my bed," Margaret said sharply. "There's a room in the back. It's cold, but it's got a bed and some blankets. Better than the floor." Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Holloway." "It's just Holloway. I'm a widow." "Miss Holloway, then." "Just Holloway works fine." She stood and led them through the main room to the door she hadn't opened in 6 years. Her hand rested on the latch for a moment, something tightening in her throat. Then she pushed it open. The room was exactly as she'd left it. 2 narrow beds pushed against opposite walls, a small dresser, a braided rug on the floor. The air smelled stale, closed off, but it was dry and the roof didn't leak. "Blankets are in the chest," she said, not stepping inside. "There's a chamber pot under the far bed. I'll stoke the fire in the stove before I turn in. Should keep some heat coming through the wall." "This is more than generous," Ethan said. He was standing close enough that she could smell the cold still clinging to his coat, the faint scent of horse and leather and wood smoke. Margaret stepped back. "Storm should blow through by morning. You can be on your way after breakfast." She didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked back to the main room, her heart beating too fast. Behind her, she heard Ethan murmur something to Sam, heard the creak of the bed as the boy climbed into it. Margaret stood by the fire for a long time, staring into the flames. The wind howled outside, the snow beating against the windows. She'd lived through hundreds of storms in this house. This one was no different, except it was, because for the first time in 11 years, she wasn't alone. The storm raged all night. Margaret lay in her bed, listening to the wind scream and the house groan under the assault. She didn't sleep well, hadn't slept well in years, but tonight was worse. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift of weight in the other room pulled her toward wakefulness. She was painfully aware of the 2 strangers under her roof, of the violation of her carefully maintained solitude. And yet, there was something else too, something she didn't want to name, a strange, uncomfortable awareness that the silence she'd grown so accustomed to had been broken, and the breaking of it made her realize how heavy that silence had become. When dawn finally came, it was gray and muted. The storm had spent itself some time before sunrise, leaving behind a world buried in white. Margaret rose, dressed quickly in the cold, and went to stoke the fire. She moved quietly, not wanting to wake her guests, but when she entered the main room, she found Ethan already awake. He was sitting at the table, his hands wrapped around a cup of water, staring out the window at the snow. He looked up when she entered. "Morning," he said quietly. "Morning." Margaret moved to the stove, began building up the fire. "Coffee's not much, but I can make some if you want." "I'd appreciate that." She set about the familiar routine: water from the bucket by the door, grounds from the tin on the shelf, the old pot set to boil. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was loaded with things unsaid. "Hell of a storm," Ethan said finally. "They get worse than that." "I believe you." Margaret glanced at him. In the morning light, he looked even more worn down than he had the night before. There were lines around his eyes, a tightness to his mouth that spoke of chronic worry. "Your boy's still asleep?" she asked. "Yeah, he didn't sleep well. Had nightmares." "About what?" Ethan's hands tightened around his cup. His mother. There it was. The story starting to unfold whether either of them wanted it to or not. Margaret didn't ask. She just waited. "She died 4 months ago," Ethan said, his voice carefully flat. "Fever. Started as a cough, turned into something worse. We were living in a mining camp outside Butte, no doctor within 20 miles. By the time I got someone to come look at her, it was too late." "I'm sorry." "So am I." The coffee began to boil. Margaret poured 2 cups, set one in front of Ethan, kept one for herself. They drank in silence. "The mine closed down 3 weeks after she died," Ethan continued. "No work, no money, no reason to stay. Heard about the ranch job up north. Figured it was as good a direction as any. In February, he agreed. "Like I said, not my smartest decision." Margaret looked at him over the rim of her cup. "Why'd you really leave, Mr. Cole?" Ethan met her eyes. "Because that camp was full of ghosts, and my boy was drowning in them. I had to get him out of there before he forgot how to breathe." Margaret understood that better than she wanted to. She'd stayed here surrounded by ghosts for 11 years. She knew exactly what it did to you. "The ranch job real?" she asked. "I hope so. And if it's not, then I'll find another one. With winter still on and a child in tow. I've survived worse." "Have you?" Ethan's smile was bitter. "I'm here, aren't I?" Before Margaret could respond, a small voice came from the doorway. "Papa?" Sam stood there, his hair sticking up in all directions, his eyes still heavy with sleep. He looked impossibly small in the overlarge shirt he'd slept in. "Morning, buddy," Ethan said, his whole face softening. "Come here." Sam crossed the room and climbed onto his father's lap, tucking himself against Ethan's chest. Ethan wrapped his arms around the boy, resting his chin on top of Sam's head. Margaret turned away, busying herself at the stove. The sight of them together hurt something in her chest that she thought was too scarred to hurt anymore. "I'll make some porridge," she said. "You don't have to. I'm making it anyway." She cooked in silence, measuring out oats and water, adding a precious spoonful of honey from the jar she saved for special occasions. This wasn't special, this was just necessary. Behind her, she could hear Ethan talking softly to Sam, asking about his sleep, making quiet plans for the day. They ate breakfast together, the 3 of them at the table. Sam was quiet, picking at his food, but Ethan coaxed him into eating with gentle persistence. Margaret watched them when she thought they weren't looking, trying to understand this strange intimacy between father and son, this careful tenderness. After breakfast, Ethan stood. "I should check on the horses, make sure they made it through all right." "They're in my barn?" "I put them there last night before I knocked. Hope that was all right." Margaret felt a flash of irritation. He'd made himself at home before even asking, but it was practical. The horses would have died otherwise. "I'll come with you," she said. "Need to check on my cow anyway." They bundled up against the cold, Margaret lending Sam an old coat that had belonged to William. It swallowed him, the sleeves hanging past his hands, but it was warm. They stepped outside into a world transformed. The snow had drifted 3 feet high in places, sculpted by the wind into strange shapes. The sky was clear now, achingly blue, the sun brilliant on the white landscape. It was beautiful and brutal, the kind of beauty that could kill you if you weren't careful. They trudged through the snow to the barn. Inside, it was dim and smelled of hay and animal warmth. Patience the cow looked at them with bovine indifference from her stall. Ethan's 2 horses, a bay gelding and a smaller paint mare, stood in the stalls Margaret hadn't used in years. "They look good," Ethan said, checking them over. "Better than they should, given the night." "Barn's solid," Margaret said. "Roof doesn't leak." "Not many barns out here can say that." Margaret shrugged. Thomas had built it to last. It was one of the few things that had. Sam had wandered over to Patience's stall and was staring at the cow with fascination. "Never seen a cow before?" Margaret asked. "Not up close," Sam said quietly. "Can I touch her?" "If she'll let you. She's got her own mind about these things." Sam reached out carefully, his small hand resting on Patience's broad neck. The cow didn't move. The boy's face lit up with wonder. "She's soft," he said. "She's old and stubborn and gives barely enough milk to bother with," Margaret said. "But yeah, she's soft." Ethan was watching his son with an expression that made Margaret's chest tight. Love, pure and uncomplicated and fierce. She remembered that feeling, remembered loving her boys like that, with every breath in her body. "I need to check the fences," Margaret said abruptly. "Make sure nothing's down." "I'll help," Ethan said immediately. "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to, but I'm going to anyway. Sam can stay in the barn where it's warm." Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to tell him she'd been handling this place alone for years and didn't need his help. But the truth was, checking fences after a storm like this was hard work, and having an extra set of hands would make it go faster. "Fine," she said, "but keep up." They spent the next 2 hours working their way around the property. The snow was deep and the going was slow, but Ethan was strong and capable, pulling downed branches off fence lines, helping her shore up a section that had sagged under the weight of the drifts. He didn't talk much, just worked steadily beside her, taking direction without complaint. Margaret found herself watching him when he wasn't looking. The way he moved, economical and efficient. The way he approached each task with quiet competence. He wasn't trying to impress her, wasn't showing off. He was just working, the way a man worked when work was simply what you did. By the time they made it back to the barn, her muscles were burning and her breath was coming hard. She wasn't as young as she used to be, and her pride had made her push too hard. "You all right?" Ethan asked. "I'm fine." "You're limping." "Old injury, axe up in the cold." "Maybe you should rest." "I said I'm fine." Ethan held up his hands in surrender. "Yes, ma'am." Inside the barn, Sam had fallen asleep in the hay near Patience's stall, curled up like a cat in a patch of sunlight coming through the gaps in the boards. He looked peaceful for the first time since Margaret had seen him. "He doesn't sleep much," Ethan said quietly. "Not since his mama died, but when he does, I hate to wake him." "Then don't," Margaret said. "I need to go inside and start dinner anyway. You can bring him in when he wakes." "Thank you." Margaret left them there and made her way back to the house. Inside, she peeled off her wet things and hung them by the fire to dry. Her wrist was aching, a deep bone ache that meant the cold had settled into the old break. She rubbed it absently, staring into the fire. She'd expected them to be gone by now, expected to have her solitude back. But the road north was buried under 3 feet of snow, and even if they could dig out the wagon, the horses wouldn't make it a mile. They were stuck here. For how long, she didn't know. Days, maybe. A week if more storms came. The thought should have filled her with dread. Instead, she felt something else, something that terrified her more than any storm. Relief. 3 days passed. The snow melted slowly, stubbornly. More storms came, smaller than the first, but persistent, adding inches here and there, making travel impossible. Ethan and Sam settled into the rhythms of the house like they'd always been there. Ethan insisted on helping with everything, chopping wood, hauling water, fixing the shutter that had been hanging crooked for 2 years. Sam followed his father around like a shadow, quiet and watchful, slowly thawing in the warmth of the house. Margaret told herself she was tolerating them out of basic human decency. That was all. But on the 4th night, something shifted. They'd just finished dinner, venison stew that Ethan had made from a deer he'd shot that morning, and Margaret was washing dishes when Sam approached her. He stood at her elbow, clutching something in his hands. "Miss Holloway?" His voice was barely above a whisper. Margaret looked down. What is it? Sam held out a small wooden horse carved with surprising detail. Papa made this for me before Mama died. Do you want to see it? Margaret dried her hands on her apron and knelt down so she was eye level with the boy. She took the horse carefully, turning it over in her hands. It was beautiful work, each leg carefully shaped, the mane suggested by delicate grooves in the wood. Your papa made this? She asked. Sam nodded. He makes things. He's real good at it. Margaret looked up and found Ethan watching them from across the room, his expression unreadable. It's fine work, she said, handing the horse back to Sam. You should take good care of it. I will, Sam said solemnly. Then, hesitantly, do you have a little boy? The question hit her like a fist. Margaret's breath caught, her chest suddenly too tight. I did, she managed. 2 of them, but they're gone now. Like my mama? Yes, like your mama. Sam considered this, his small face serious. Does it stop hurting? Margaret felt something crack inside her. She reached out and gently touched the boy's cheek. No, she said honestly, but you learn to carry it. Sam nodded as if this made perfect sense. Then he did something Margaret didn't expect. He leaned forward and wrapped his thin arms around her neck, hugging her with the uncomplicated trust of a child who still believed the world might offer comfort. Margaret froze. She couldn't remember the last time someone had touched her with affection. Couldn't remember the last time she'd allowed it. Her arms came up slowly, hesitantly, and she hugged the boy back, feeling the fragile weight of him against her chest. When Sam pulled away, he was smiling. It was the first real smile she'd seen from him. Thank you for letting us stay, he said. Then he ran back to his father, climbing into Ethan's lap with his wooden horse. Margaret stood slowly, her knees protesting. She turned back to the dishes, but her hands were shaking. That night, after Sam had gone to bed, Margaret sat by the fire with her mending. Ethan sat across from her, working on a piece of leather harness that needed repair, his hands moving with practiced skill. He likes you, Ethan said without looking up. He's a child. He's lonely. He's a good judge of people, always has been. Margaret didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Can I ask you something? Ethan said finally. You can ask. Why do you stay here, alone like this? Margaret's needle paused. Where else would I go? I don't know, town, family somewhere, anywhere that's less... He gestured around the cabin. This is my home. It's also killing you, slowly. Margaret looked up sharply. You don't know anything about me, Mr. Cole. I know enough. I know you work yourself to exhaustion every day trying to keep this place running with no help. I know you're lonely even if you won't admit it. I know you've given up on everything except surviving, and surviving isn't the same as living. And what would you know about living? Margaret shot back, anger flaring hot and sudden. You're running from your ghost same as I am. You're right, Ethan said calmly. I am, but at least I'm running toward something too. What are you running toward, Miss Holloway? Nothing, because I'm not running. I'm staying. I'm honoring what my husband built, what my son should have had. Your husband is dead. Your sons are dead. You don't owe them your whole life. Margaret stood abruptly, her mending falling to the floor. You don't get to come into my house and tell me how to grieve. Ethan stood too, but his voice stayed gentle. I'm not telling you how to grieve. I'm telling you that grief isn't supposed to be a life sentence. What the hell do you know about it? Your wife's been gone 4 months. Try 11 years and then talk to me about grief. You're right. I don't know what 11 years feels like, but I know what 4 months feels like, and it's hell. And I know that if I let it, that hell will swallow me and my son whole. So I'm choosing something different. I'm choosing to keep moving, keep living, keep hoping that somewhere down the road there's something better than this pain. Hope is for fools, Margaret said, but her voice cracked. Maybe, but I'd rather be a fool with hope than wise and dead inside. They stared at each other across the fire, the air between them charged with something Margaret couldn't name. She wanted to rage at him, wanted to throw him out into the snow, wanted to slam the door on whatever he was making her feel. But she couldn't, because somewhere deep in the frozen wasteland of her heart, Something had started to thaw, and it hurt worse than anything she'd felt in years. "I think you should leave as soon as the road clears," she said quietly. "If that's what you want." "It is." Ethan nodded slowly. "All right, but I need you to know something first." "What?" "These past few days, watching you with Sam, seeing how you run this place, how you survive against odds that would break most people. You're the strongest woman I've ever met, and you deserve better than this lonely existence you've sentenced yourself to." "You don't know what I deserve." "Maybe not, but I know you deserve more than you're allowing yourself to have." He held her gaze for another moment, then bent down, picked up her mending, and handed it to her. His fingers brushed hers just for a second, and Margaret felt it like a shock of electricity. "Good night, Miss Holloway," he said softly. "Good night." She watched him walk to the back room, heard the door close quietly behind him. Then she sank back into her chair, her mending clutched in her hands, and stared into the fire until it burned down to embers. Outside, the wind picked up again, howling around the corners of the house. But inside, something had changed. Something had been said that couldn't be unsaid, and Margaret knew with terrible certainty that when Ethan Cole and his son finally left, they would take something of her with them. And she wasn't sure she could afford to lose any more pieces of herself than she already had. But the storm wasn't finished with any of them yet. Not even close. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She lay in her bed listening to the wind and replaying Ethan's words over and over in her mind. "You deserve better than this lonely existence you've sentenced yourself to." The audacity of it, the presumption, the terrible, aching truth of it. She rose before dawn, moving quietly through the cold house to start the fire. Her hands worked automatically, building the kindling, coaxing the flames to life. But her mind was elsewhere. She kept seeing Sam's small arms around her neck, kept feeling the weight of that trust, that need, kept hearing Ethan's voice saying she was the strongest woman he'd ever met. No one had said anything like that to her in more than a decade. When the fire was going strong, she put the coffee on and stood at the window, watching the sun rise over the snowfield. The world was still buried in white, pristine, and untouched, reflecting the early light in shades of pink and gold. Beautiful, desolate, like everything else in this God-forsaken territory. She heard movement behind her and turned to find Ethan in the doorway. His hair was disheveled from sleep, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept much either. "Morning," he said quietly. "Morning." Margaret turned back to the window. "Coffee's almost ready." "Thank you." They stood in uncomfortable silence for a moment, the weight of last night's conversation hanging between them like smoke. "About what I said," Ethan began. "Don't!" "Miss Holloway, I said don't." Margaret's voice was sharp. "You spoke your piece. I heard it. We don't need to discuss it further." Ethan crossed the room to stand beside her at the window. Not too close, but close enough that she could feel his presence like heat from a fire. "I overstepped," he said. "It wasn't my place to judge how you've chosen to live." "No, it wasn't. But I'm not sorry I said it." Margaret's jaw tightened. "Of course you're not, because it's true. And because someone needs to say it to you. Someone needs to tell you that you're more than this half-life you're living. And you think you're that someone? A stranger who showed up on my doorstep 4 days ago? Maybe that's exactly why I can say it. Because I'm a stranger. Because I don't have any history with you, any reason to tiptoe around the truth." Margaret finally looked at him. His eyes were steady, clear, holding hers without flinching. "You don't know me well enough to know what the truth is," she said. "Then tell me I'm wrong. Tell me you're happy here, alone, working yourself into the ground with no one to talk to, no one to share the burden. Tell me this is the life you want. What I want doesn't matter. That's where you're wrong. What you want is the only thing that matters." Easy for you to say. You've got a child depending on you, a reason to keep going. I've got nothing. No family, no future, no purpose except to tend to a piece of land that'll outlive me by 100 years. You've got yourself. Isn't that enough? Margaret laughed, a bitter sound. Myself? That's a sad joke. Why? Because you've been hurt? Because you've lost people? That doesn't make you worthless, Miss Holloway. It makes you human. It makes me broken. We're all broken. Every single one of us. Ethan's voice softened. But broken doesn't mean useless. Broken doesn't mean finished. Broken just means we've survived something that tried to destroy us, and we're still here. Margaret felt her throat tighten. She wanted to argue, wanted to push him away, but the words wouldn't come. Because somewhere in the deepest part of her, the part she'd locked away and tried to forget, she wanted to believe him. The coffee began to boil. Margaret turned away from the window and busied herself pouring 2 cups, grateful for the distraction. When she handed one to Ethan, their fingers brushed again, and she pulled back quickly. "I checked the road yesterday afternoon while you were in the barn with Sam," Ethan said. "It's still impassable. Another few days at least before we can get through." "I figured as much. I can work while we're here. Whatever you need done. Consider it payment for the room and board." "You don't have to. I know I don't have to, but I want to. Please, let me help you." Margaret studied him over the rim of her cup. There was no pity in his eyes, no condescension, just honest willingness to share the burden. When was the last time anyone had offered to help her without expecting something in return? "Fine," she said finally. "The chicken coop needs mucking out, and there's a section of roof on the barn that's been leaking. If you can patch it before the next snow, I'd be grateful." "Consider it done." They drank their coffee in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before, less hostile, more companionable, like 2 people who'd reached an understanding even if they didn't quite know what that understanding was yet. Sam emerged from the back room a few minutes later, rubbing his eyes. He climbed into his father's lap without a word, and Ethan wrapped his arms around the boy, resting his chin on top of his head in that gesture Margaret was coming to recognize as habit. "Morning, buddy," Ethan murmured. "Morning, Papa." Sam looked at Margaret. "Morning, Miss Holloway." "Morning, Sam. You hungry?" "Yes, ma'am." Margaret made porridge again, this time adding dried apples she'd been saving. She told herself it was practical, that the boy needed the nutrition, but the truth was she wanted to see his face light up when he tasted the sweetness. And it did. His eyes went wide and he grinned at her, a real honest-to-goodness grin that made her heart ache. After breakfast, Ethan bundled up and headed out to tackle the chicken coop. Sam wanted to go with him, but the cold was too bitter, so Margaret found herself alone with the boy for the first time. He sat at the table with his wooden horse, making it gallop across the scarred wood surface. Margaret cleared the dishes, acutely aware of his presence, unsure what to do with a child in her space. "Miss Holloway?" Sam's voice was small. "Yes?" "Can I ask you something?" "I suppose." "Were your boys nice?" Margaret's hand stilled in the dishwater. "They were. Very nice." "What were their names?" "Daniel and William. Danny and Will." "Did they play together?" "All the time. Sometimes they fought, the way brothers do, but mostly they were best friends." Sam considered this, his small face serious. "I wish I had a brother." "You might someday." "Mama said that too, before she got sick. She said maybe we'd have another baby and I could be a big brother." His voice dropped. "But then she died." Margaret dried her hands and came to sit at the table beside him. "That must have been very hard for you." Papa cried. "I heard him at night when he thought I was sleeping. I never heard a grown-up cry before." "Your papa loves you very much. Sometimes love hurts so much that crying is the only thing that helps." "Do you cry?" "Not anymore." "Why not?" "I guess I ran out of tears a long time ago." Sam reached out and patted her hand with his small one. The gesture was so unexpected, so tender, that Margaret felt something crack in her chest. "Maybe you'll find more," he said solemnly. "Tears, I mean. Papa says sometimes they hide for a while, but they always come back when you need them." Margaret looked at this small, wise child and wondered when she'd become so hardened that a boy of 7 could see through her better than she could see through herself. "Maybe," she said softly. "Maybe I will." They sat together for a while, Sam playing with his horse, Margaret mending a shirt. The companionable silence was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of Ethan working outside. It should have felt strange, this domestic scene, but instead it felt almost natural. Around midday, Sam started to fade, his eyes growing heavy. Margaret made him a bed on the sofa near the fire, covering him with one of her good quilts. He was asleep within minutes, his small body curled up like a comma. Margaret stood watching him sleep, this child who'd wandered into her life on the back of a storm. His face was peaceful now, the worry lines smoothed away, his breathing deep and even. She reached out and gently brushed the hair from his forehead, the way she used to do with her own boys. The touch burned like frostbite. She pulled her hand back quickly and turned away, her heart racing. This was dangerous, this caring, this softness creeping back into the places she'd worked so hard to harden. If she wasn't careful, she'd start hoping again, and hope was the cruelest thing of all. She grabbed her coat and headed outside, needing air, needing distance. The cold hit her like a slap, sharp and clarifying. She found Ethan in the barn, up on the roof, his hammer ringing out in steady rhythm. "How's it going?" she called up. Ethan looked down, his face flushed from exertion. "Found the leak. Bigger than I thought, but I can fix it. Might take a couple of days, though." "That's fine. I've lived with it this long." Ethan climbed down the ladder, his movements sure and confident. "Sam inside?" "Sleeping on the sofa." "He sleeps better here than he has in months. Don't know if it's the quiet or the warmth or—" He trailed off, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Or what?" "Or you. He talks about you like you hung the moon, Miss Holloway." Margaret snorted. "He barely knows me." Kids have good instincts. They can tell when someone's good people, even if that someone works real hard to hide it. "I'm not hiding anything. Aren't you?" Before Margaret could respond, a sound cut through the air. A shout, distant but clear, coming from the direction of the road. Ethan's head snapped up. "Someone's out there." They moved quickly, trudging through the snow toward the road. As they got closer, Margaret could see a figure struggling through the drifts, leading a limping horse. As they approached, she recognized him, Jacob Turner, one of the hands from the Stevens Ranch 6 miles east. "Jacob," she called out, "what happened?" The young man looked up, relief flooding his face. "Miss Holloway, thank heaven. Horse threw a shoe and came up lame about 2 miles back. Been walking since dawn." "Come on," Ethan said, taking the horse's reins. "Let's get you both inside." They got Jacob and his horse settled in the barn, then brought the young man up to the house. He was maybe 20, tall and gangly, with a shock of red hair and a face full of freckles. Margaret had seen him in town a few times, but didn't know him well. She made him coffee and warmed up the leftover stew while Jacob sat by the fire, thawing out. "I was headed to Birch Creek for supplies," he explained. "Boss didn't think the roads would be this bad." "Your boss is a fool," Margaret said bluntly. "Sending someone out in weather like this." Jacob grinned. "Won't argue with you there, ma'am. But we were running low on feed, and he thought the storm had passed." Sam had woken up and was watching the stranger with curious eyes. Jacob noticed him and smiled. "Well, hello there, little man. What's your name?" "Sam," the boy said quietly. "Nice to meet you, Sam. I'm Jacob. Is your horse okay?" "He will be, once he gets some rest. Might have to stay here a few days, though, if Miss Holloway doesn't mind the company." All eyes turned to Margaret. She felt the weight of their expectation, the assumption that she'd do the right thing, the kind thing. Part of her wanted to rebel against it, to send Jacob on his way just to prove she wasn't soft. But she was tired of fighting, tired of pretending she was harder than she was. "You can stay," she said, "but you'll work for your keep, same as Mr. Cole here." "Yes, ma'am. Happy to." And just like that, her solitary house became crowded. 3 men, well, 2 men and a boy, filling the spaces she'd kept empty for so long. That evening, they all sat around her table for dinner, passing bowls and sharing conversation, and Margaret found herself on the outside of it, watching as if from a distance. Ethan and Jacob talked about ranching, about horses, about the hard winter and the harder spring to come. Sam chimed in occasionally with questions that made the men laugh, and Margaret sat at the head of her table, presiding over this strange gathering, feeling like a ghost in her own house. After dinner, Jacob offered to clean up the dishes. "I can help," Sam piped up. "Me too," Ethan added. Margaret found herself shooed away from her own kitchen, ordered to sit by the fire and rest. She wanted to protest, but the truth was her wrist was aching and her back was sore from the day's work. So she sat, listening to the men talk and the clatter of dishes, and tried to remember the last time anyone had taken care of her instead of the other way around. She couldn't. Later that night, after Jacob had bedded down in the loft and Sam was asleep in the back room, Margaret and Ethan found themselves alone again by the fire. "This is getting complicated," Margaret said. "What is?" "This. All of this. Your being here, the boy, now Jacob. My house feels too small and too full all at once. We'll be gone soon. Roads should clear in a few days." "And then what?" Ethan looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what happens when you leave, when it's quiet again, when it's just me and the wind and the empty rooms?" "I thought that's what you wanted." "I thought so too." Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. "But now I'm not so sure." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Ethan leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his eyes searching her face. "What are you saying, Miss Holloway?" "I don't know what I'm saying. I don't know anything anymore. You've turned my whole world upside down in less than a week, and I don't know how to make sense of it." "Maybe you're not supposed to make sense of it. Maybe you're just supposed to feel it." "I don't want to feel anything. Feeling hurts." "So does not feeling. Trust me, I know." Margaret met his eyes and saw the truth of it there. This man who'd lost his wife 4 months ago, who was trying to hold himself and his son together through sheer force of will. He understood pain. He understood loss. He understood what it cost to keep breathing when everything in you wanted to quit. "I'm scared," she said, the words escaping before she could stop them. "Of what?" "Of this. Of caring. Of letting you matter and then losing you too. You might lose me, that's true. Life doesn't come with guarantees." Ethan paused. "But you might not lose me. You might gain something instead. Isn't that possibility worth the risk?" "I don't know if I'm brave enough for that." "You're the bravest person I know. You've survived things that would have killed most people. This is just another kind of survival. This doesn't feel like survival. This feels like what? Like hope. And hope is dangerous." Ethan reached across the space between them and took her hand. His palm was warm, calloused from work, strong. Margaret's first instinct was to pull away, but she didn't. She let him hold her hand, let herself feel the simple human comfort of touch. "Hope is dangerous," Ethan agreed, "but it's also necessary. Without it, we're just going through the motions, waiting to die. Is that really what you want?" "No." The word came out small, broken. "No, it's not." "Then let yourself hope. Just a little. Just enough to see what happens." Margaret looked down at their joined hands, his fingers intertwined with hers. It had been 11 years since a man had touched her with anything resembling tenderness. 11 years since she'd allowed herself to want it. "I don't know how," she whispered. "Start small. Tomorrow morning, when you wake up, let yourself hope that it'll be a good day. That's all. Just one day at a time. And if it's not a good day, then you try again the next day, and the day after that, until one day you realize more of them are good than bad." Margaret wanted to tell him he was naive, that he didn't understand how deep her scars went, how completely she'd given up. But looking at him, at this man who'd buried his wife 4 months ago and was still trying to build a future for his son, she realized he understood better than anyone. They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped, the fire burning low, neither of them speaking. And for the first time in more years than Margaret could count, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like possibility. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Margaret woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon, and for a moment she was disoriented, unsure where she was. Then she remembered. Ethan was cooking breakfast. She could hear him moving around in the kitchen, could hear Sam's quiet laughter and Jacob's deeper voice. Her house was full of life again. She dressed quickly and came out to find all 3 of them working in easy coordination. Ethan at the stove, Sam setting the table, Jacob stoking the fire. They looked up when she entered and Ethan smiled. "Morning, hope you don't mind. Figured we'd let you sleep in for once." "I don't sleep in." "You did today. It's past 7. Margaret blinked. She couldn't remember the last time she'd slept past dawn. Her body usually woke her at first light, whether she wanted it to or not. "Sit," Ethan said, gesturing to the table. "Breakfast is almost ready." Margaret sat, feeling strange and off balance. This was her house, her kitchen, her routine, but these three had taken it over with an ease that should have annoyed her and instead felt almost welcome. Ethan served up eggs and bacon, luxuries she rarely indulged in. "Found the eggs in the coop this morning. Hope that's all right." "Where else would you find eggs?" "I meant using them. I know you usually trade them in town. Eat them. We're feeding 3 extra mouths. Might as well use what we have." They ate together, the conversation flowing easily. Jacob told stories about working on the Stevens ranch, making Sam laugh with tales of ornery cattle and stubborn horses. Ethan chimed in with his own stories from various jobs he'd worked over the years. Margaret found herself listening, occasionally adding a comment, slowly being pulled into the warmth of shared company. After breakfast, Ethan and Jacob went out to work on the barn roof together. Sam asked if he could stay inside with Margaret, and she found herself agreeing before she could think better of it. "What should we do?" Sam asked, looking up at her with those serious brown eyes. Margaret considered. "Do you know how to read?" "A little. Mama was teaching me, but then she—" He trailed off. "Would you like to keep learning?" Sam's face lit up. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret went to the shelf where she kept her few precious books and pulled down the primer she'd used to teach William. The pages were yellowed, the binding cracked, but the words were still clear. They sat at the table together, Sam sounding out words while Margaret corrected gently, praising him when he got them right. The boy was bright, eager to learn, his small finger tracing under each line as he read. "You're doing very well," Margaret said after an hour. "Really? Really? Your mother taught you well." Sam's expression grew sad. "I miss her." "I know you do." "Do you miss your boys?" "Every day." "Does Papa remind you of them?" The question caught Margaret off guard. "No, your father is different." "Different how?" How could she explain to a child that Ethan reminded her not of her sons, but of possibilities she'd thought were dead? That he made her feel things she'd sworn never to feel again? "He's kind," she said finally, "and patient, and he clearly loves you very much. He says you're strong. He told Jacob last night when they thought I was asleep. He said you're the strongest woman he's ever met, and that you deserve better than being alone." Margaret's breath caught. "Did he now?" "He also said he wishes you could see yourself the way he sees you." "And how does he see me?" Sam tilted his head, considering. "Like you're important. Like you matter." Margaret felt her eyes burn with unexpected tears. She blinked them back quickly, but not before Sam noticed. "Are you crying?" he asked, concerned. "No, just something in my eye." Sam studied her for a moment, then did something that broke her completely. He climbed into her lap, wrapping his small arms around her neck and hugging her tight. "It's okay to cry, Miss Holloway. Papa says tears are just love with nowhere to go." And just like that, the dam broke. Margaret wrapped her arms around this child and cried for the first time in 11 years. Great. Wrenching sobs that shook her whole body, years of grief and loneliness and pain pouring out of her like poison from a wound. Sam held her through it all, his small hand patting her back, murmuring, "It's okay," over and over like a prayer. When the storm finally passed, Margaret felt emptied out, hollowed, but also lighter, as if she'd been carrying a weight for so long she'd forgotten it was there until it was lifted. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice hoarse. "Don't be sorry. Papa cries too. It means you're feeling things, and feeling things means you're alive." Margaret looked at this impossibly wise child and wondered what she'd done to deserve his presence in her life. "Thank you, Sam," she whispered. "You're welcome." He climbed off her lap and picked up the primer. "Can we read more?" Margaret laughed, a watery sound. "Yes, we can read more." They spent the rest of the morning with the books, Sam's clear voice filling the quiet house with words and life. And Margaret realized something that both terrified and exhilarated her. She was starting to hope again. That evening, after another shared meal and easy conversation, after Sam had gone to bed and Jacob had climbed to the loft, Ethan found Margaret outside on the porch. She was wrapped in a shawl, staring up at the stars. "Beautiful night," he said, coming to stand beside her. "Cold, though." "Worth it for the view." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, their breath misting in the frigid air. "Sam said you cried today," Ethan said quietly. Margaret stiffened. "He told you that?" "He was worried about you. I told him crying was nothing to worry about, that sometimes it's the healthiest thing a person can do. Your son is wise beyond his years. He's had to grow up too fast." Ethan paused. "Are you all right?" "I think so. I think I'm more all right than I've been in a very long time." "Good." He hesitated, then said, "The road's clearing. Jacob thinks he can make it to town by tomorrow if his horse is sound. We could go with him." Margaret's heart clenched. "Is that what you want?" "I'm asking what you want." She looked at him, at this man who'd wandered into her life on a storm and refused to let her hide. "I want you to stay." The words hung in the frozen air between them, impossible to take back. Ethan turned to face her fully. "For how long?" "I don't know. Longer. Maybe—" She took a breath. "Maybe for good." "Margaret." It was the first time he'd used her given name. "Do you know what you're saying?" "I'm saying I'm tired of being alone. I'm saying your son makes my house feel like a home again. I'm saying you make me want to hope, and I haven't wanted that in 11 years. I can't promise you forever. I can't promise I won't hurt you or disappoint you, or I'm not asking for promises. I'm just asking you to stay. To give this, whatever this is, a chance." Ethan studied her face in the starlight, and Margaret saw the war in his eyes. The fear and the hope, the doubt and the desire. "I have nothing to offer you," he said finally. "No land, no money, no prospects beyond a maybe job 300 miles north. I'm a man with a child and a handful of belongings and more grief than sense. And I'm a woman with a failing homestead, no family, and more scars than skin. Seems like we're well matched." A smile tugged at his lips. "When you put it that way. Stay, Ethan, please." He reached up and cupped her face in his hand, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. Margaret leaned into the touch, starved for it. "All right," he whispered. "We'll stay." And there, under the Montana stars, surrounded by snow and cold and the promise of harder days to come, Margaret Holloway allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, love hadn't passed her by after all. Maybe it had just been waiting for exactly the right moment to arrive. Jacob left the next morning, his horse sound enough to make the journey, his saddlebags full of bread Margaret had baked before dawn. He shook Ethan's hand, tipped his hat to Margaret, and ruffled Sam's hair before heading down the road toward town. They watched him go until he was just a speck against the white landscape, and then they were three again. Just three. The word felt both too small and too large for what they were becoming. That first week after Margaret asked them to stay was strange and careful, like learning to walk on ice. They circled each other with polite distance, uncertain of the new boundaries they were drawing. Ethan and Sam kept to the back room at night. Margaret kept to hers. During the day, they worked together with deliberate courtesy, passing tools and sharing meals, and speaking in measured tones that didn't quite mask the tension humming beneath the surface. Because asking someone to stay and knowing what to do with them once they stayed were two entirely different things. Margaret found herself hyper-aware of Ethan's presence in ways that made her feel foolish. The sound of his boots on the floorboards, the way he moved through her kitchen like he belonged there, the sight of him at her table in the morning, his hair still mussed from sleep, his shirt unbuttoned at the throat. She was 53 years old, for heaven's sake. Too old for this kind of awareness, this kind of wanting. But apparently her body hadn't gotten that message. She caught him watching her too. When she was kneading bread, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. When she was reading with Sam, her voice soft as she helped him sound out words. When she stood at the window in the early morning light, her hair down and loose before she braided it. His eyes would linger for just a moment too long before he'd look away, a flush creeping up his neck. Neither of them spoke of it. Sam, bless him, seemed oblivious to the undercurrents. He moved between them with easy affection, climbing into Ethan's lap one moment and bringing Margaret wildflowers he'd found poking through the snow the next. He chattered about everything and nothing, filling the silences that might have grown awkward, keeping them tethered to the simple, uncomplicated present. But the present couldn't last forever. It was Sam who brought things to a head, though he didn't know it. They were sitting at dinner one evening, nearly 2 weeks after Jacob had left. The days were getting longer now, the snow starting to recede in patches, revealing the brown grass underneath. Spring was coming, slow and reluctant, but coming nonetheless. "Miss Holloway," Sam said, pushing his beans around his plate, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Are you going to be my new mama?" The question landed like a stone in still water. Margaret's fork clattered against her plate. Ethan choked on his coffee. Sam looked between them, confused by their reactions. "I just thought, since Papa said we're staying and you're letting us live here, that maybe—" He trailed off, his small face uncertain. Margaret found her voice first. "Sam, it's not that simple." "Why not?" "Because your mama just died. She's not someone who can be replaced." "I don't want to replace her," Sam said seriously. "I just thought maybe you could be a different kind of mama. A new one." Ethan set down his cup carefully. "Sam, Buddy, Miss Holloway and I, we haven't what? We're not married, son. We're just sharing the house, helping each other out." Sam's brow furrowed. "But you like each other, don't you? I see the way you look at her, Papa. The same way you used to look at Mama." Ethan's face went red. "Sam, and Miss Holloway looks at you too. When she thinks no one's watching, she smiles." Margaret felt heat flood her cheeks. "Sam, that's not appropriate." "Why not? Don't grown-ups talk about feelings?" Out of the mouths of children. Margaret looked at Ethan, who was staring at his plate like it held the secrets of the universe. The air in the room felt thick, charged with everything they'd been carefully not saying. "Sam," Ethan said quietly, "why don't you go get ready for bed? Miss Holloway and I need to talk." "Did I say something wrong?" "Nobody. You just said something true, and sometimes the truth is complicated." Sam slid off his chair, looking worried. He went to Margaret first, wrapping his arms around her waist. "I'm sorry if I made you sad." Margaret hugged him back, her throat tight. "You didn't make me sad, sweetheart. You just made me think about things I've been trying not to think about." "Is thinking about them bad?" "No, just scary." "Papa says being scared doesn't mean you shouldn't do something. It just means it matters." Margaret looked over Sam's head at Ethan, who was watching them with an expression that made her chest ache. "Your papa is a smart man." "I know," Sam said matter-of-factly. Then he went to his father, kissed him goodnight, and disappeared into the back room. The silence he left behind was deafening. Margaret stood and began clearing the dishes, needing something to do with her hands. Ethan stood too, bringing his plate to the basin. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't know he was thinking about that. I should have talked to him, explained..." "Explained what? That we're two broken people sharing a house because we're too scared to be alone? That we dance around each other like nervous teenagers because neither of us knows what we're doing? Is that what you think this is?" Margaret's hand stilled in the dishwater. "I don't know what this is, Ethan. You tell me." He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low, careful. "I think it's two people who've been through hell trying to figure out if they have the courage to reach for something good. And do we? Have the courage? I don't know. Do we?" Margaret turned to face him, her wet hands dripping on the floor. "I'm 53 years old. I'm too old for you, too old for this, too old to be entertaining romantic notions like some foolish girl." "You're not too old." "I am. Look at me, Ethan. Really look. I'm gray and weathered and worn down. I've got nothing to offer you except a failing homestead and a lifetime of baggage." Ethan stepped closer. "You want me to really look at you? Fine. I see a woman who survived losing everything and kept going. I see someone who took in strangers during a storm, even though it scared her. I see hands that can coax life from frozen ground, and a heart that's been broken so many times it's a miracle it still beats. I see strength and resilience, and a beauty that has nothing to do with age and everything to do with who you are." "Stop," Margaret whispered. "Why? Because it makes you uncomfortable to hear the truth? Because you've convinced yourself you don't deserve it?" "Because I'm terrified." The words burst out of her, raw and desperate. I'm terrified of letting you matter and then losing you. I'm terrified of loving your son and watching him grow up and leave. I'm terrified of hoping for something and having it ripped away again because that's what always happens. Everything I love dies or leaves, and I can't survive that again. I can't. Ethan closed the distance between them, his hands coming up to frame her face. You're right to be terrified. I'm terrified too. Every day I wake up and think about how much it would destroy me to lose you now that I've found you. But I'm more terrified of walking away, of spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been if I'd just been brave enough to try. We barely know each other. I know enough. I know you make the best bread I've ever tasted, and you're teaching my son to read with more patience than I've ever had. I know you check on the animals 3 times a night when the weather's bad, and you only sleep about 4 hours because you're so used to doing everything alone. I know you hum when you think no one's listening and you've memorized the constellation patterns. I know you're lonely and scared and convinced you don't deserve happiness, and I know I want to spend however long you'll let me proving you wrong. Margaret's eyes were burning with tears she refused to shed. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to let someone in. Then let me teach you. Let me be patient with you the way you're patient with Sam. Let me show you that not everyone leaves, that sometimes people stay. For how long? As long as you want me. What if I want you forever, and forever doesn't exist? Ethan's thumb brushed across her cheekbone, catching a tear that had escaped despite her best efforts. Then we'll take whatever time we get and make it enough. Margaret closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. Every instinct she had screamed at her to pull away, to protect herself, to rebuild the walls before it was too late. But there was another voice, too, quieter but persistent. The voice that sounded like Sam saying, being scared doesn't mean you shouldn't do something. It just means it matters. I can't promise I won't push you away, she said, her eyes still closed. I can't promise I won't be difficult or stubborn or impossible. I know. I can't promise I know how to be what you need. I'm not asking for promises, Margaret. I'm asking for a chance. She opened her eyes and found him watching her with such naked hope that it hurt to see. When had anyone looked at her like that? When had anyone wanted her so openly, so honestly? Just a chance, she whispered. I think I can do that. Ethan smiled, and it transformed his whole face, chasing away the shadows and the grief and the weariness. Yeah? Yeah. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away, to change her mind, to retreat. But Margaret didn't move. She let him close the distance, let his lips brush against hers in a kiss so gentle it almost wasn't there. Just a whisper of contact, a question asked and answered. When he pulled back, Margaret realized she was trembling. Okay? He asked softly. Okay, she managed. They stood there for a moment longer, foreheads touching, breathing the same air. Then Ethan stepped back, giving her space, not pushing for more than she could give. I should check on Sam, he said. I should finish the dishes. Margaret? Yes? Thank you for taking the chance. She watched him walk to the back room, watched the door close quietly behind him. Then she turned back to the dishes, her hands shaking, her heart pounding, her mind spinning with the enormity of what she'd just agreed to. She was taking a chance on love again. The thought terrified her, but it also made her feel more alive than she had in 11 years. The next few weeks brought a subtle but unmistakable shift in the household. Ethan and Margaret didn't make grand declarations or sudden changes, but there was a new ease between them, a comfort in proximity, touches that lingered a moment longer than necessary, smiles that held private meaning. Sam noticed, of course, and his own smiles grew wider, his laughter more frequent. They fell into new rhythms. Ethan took over more of the heavy work, repairing fences, reinforcing the barn, breaking ground in the garden as the snow finally retreated. Margaret found herself cooking more elaborate meals, not because she had to, but because she wanted to see the appreciation in Ethan's eyes when he tasted something good. Sam continued his lessons, progressing rapidly from the primer to actual books, his hunger for learning insatiable. In the evenings, after Sam was asleep, Margaret and Ethan would sit by the fire and talk. Really talk. He told her about his childhood in Missouri, about meeting Sarah at a church social when he was 19, about the joy and terror of becoming a father for the first time. She told him about Thomas, about her boys, about the slow erosion of hope that came with losing them one by one. "Does it feel like betraying them?" Ethan asked one night. "Letting yourself be happy again?" Margaret considered the question. "Sometimes. But then I think about what Thomas would say if he could see me now, bitter and alone and half alive. He'd be furious. He always said I had too much fire in me to let it go out. He was right. Was Sarah like that? Fierce?" Ethan smiled, but it was edged with sadness. Sarah was soft, kind. She saw the best in everyone, even when they didn't deserve it. She made the world feel gentler just by being in it. "I'm not like that." "No, you're different. But different doesn't mean less. You make the world feel safer, stronger. Like if you can survive what you've survived, then maybe the rest of us can too." Margaret didn't know what to say to that, so she reached across the space between them and took his hand. He laced his fingers through hers, and they sat like that until the fire burned low, finding comfort in silence and touch. But not everything was peaceful. Winter's last gasp came in late March, a vicious storm that blew in without warning and buried them in 2 feet of fresh snow overnight. Margaret woke to Ethan shaking her shoulder, his face tight with worry. "It's Sam," he said. "He's burning up." Margaret was out of bed in seconds, following Ethan to the back room. Sam lay curled on his side, his face flushed red, his breathing rapid and shallow. When she touched his forehead, the heat was shocking. "How long has he been like this?" she asked, already mentally cataloging what she had in her medicine chest. "I don't know. He was fine when he went to bed. I heard him coughing maybe an hour ago, and when I checked..." Ethan's voice cracked. "It's like Sarah. It started like this with Sarah." Margaret grabbed his shoulders, forcing him to look at her. "Listen to me. This is not Sarah. Sam is young and strong, and we caught this early, but I need you to stay calm. Can you do that?" Ethan nodded, though his eyes were wild with fear. "Good. Go stoke the fire in the stove and put water on to boil. I need clean cloths and my medicine box from the shelf in the main room. Move." Ethan moved. Margaret turned her attention to Sam, pulling back the covers to examine him. His nightshirt was soaked with sweat. When she listened to his chest, she could hear the congestion, the wet rattle that spoke of fluid in his lungs, pneumonia, or heading that way fast. She'd nursed both her boys through lung fevers before, had lost William to one in the end, but she'd also saved Daniel from 3 of them before the horse killed him. She knew what to do. The question was whether it would be enough. Ethan returned with the supplies, his hand shaking as he handed her the medicine box. "I need you to help me sit him up," Margaret said. "He can't lie flat like this. It'll make the congestion worse." Together they propped Sam against the pillows, the boy barely conscious, murmuring for his mother. Each time he did, Margaret saw Ethan flinch like he'd been struck. She made a compress with cool water and willow bark, pressing it to Sam's forehead. She prepared a steam tent with hot water and eucalyptus leaves she'd been saving for exactly this kind of emergency. She dosed him with her precious store of honey mixed with whiskey and herbs, coaxing him to swallow even in his fever haze. "What else?" Ethan asked desperately. "What else can we do?" "We wait. We keep him cool, keep him breathing, keep fluids in him. And we wait." "I can't lose him, Margaret. He's all I have left." Margaret took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "You listen to me, Ethan Cole. We are not going to lose him. Do you hear me? We're going to fight this with everything we have, and we're going to win. But I need you here. I need you present. I need you to believe we can save him because your son needs to feel that. Children know when we've given up on them, so don't you dare give up." Something shifted in Ethan's eyes, the panic receding, replaced by grim determination. "What do you need me to do?" "Stay with him. Talk to him even if he can't respond. Let him know you're here. I'm going to make a poultice for his chest." They worked through the night, trading off who sat with Sam and who prepared remedies. Margaret drew on every piece of knowledge she'd accumulated in 30 years of frontier living. Her mother's recipes, the things she'd learned from other women, the hard lessons earned through trial and error and desperate necessity. The fever climbed higher as dawn approached. Sam began to shake with chills despite the blankets they piled on him. His breathing grew more labored, each inhale a visible struggle. Margaret pressed the poultice to his chest, the heat helping to loosen the congestion. She made him drink willow bark tea even though he fought her, even though most of it ran down his chin. She sang to him, old songs from her own childhood, her voice cracking with exhaustion and fear. Ethan sat beside her, holding his son's hand, whispering prayers to a heaven he wasn't sure was listening. "Don't take him," he breathed. "Please, take me instead if you need someone, but don't take my boy." Margaret's hand found his shoulder. "He's going to make it." "You don't know that." "Yes, I do, because we're not going to let him go. Either of us." Just before noon, Sam's fever finally broke. The change was subtle at first, his breathing easing slightly, the flush in his cheeks receding a shade. But Margaret had seen it enough times to recognize it. The crisis had passed. She sagged back in her chair, suddenly aware of how bone-tired she was. Beside her, Ethan started to cry, great silent tears streaming down his face as he pressed his son's hand to his lips. "He's going to be all right," Margaret said softly. "He'll need time to recover, but the worst is over." Ethan looked at her with eyes full of gratitude and something else, something deeper. "You saved him." "We saved him. Together." He reached for her, pulling her into an embrace that was fierce and desperate and full of relief. Margaret let herself be held, let herself feel the solid warmth of him, let herself acknowledge how close they'd come to losing everything. When they finally pulled apart, Ethan cupped her face in his hands. "I love you," he said, the words stark and simple and terrifying in their honesty. "I know it's too soon and you probably don't feel the same way, but I need you to know. I love you, Margaret Holloway. I love your strength and your stubbornness and the way you fought for my son like he was your own. I love you." Margaret's heart was hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Every instinct she had screamed at her to deflect, to make a joke, to pull away. But she looked at this man who'd just poured his heart out to her. This man who'd stayed when she'd given him every reason to go. This man who'd taught her to hope again. And she knew there was only one answer she could give. "I love you too," she whispered. "Heaven help me, I do." Ethan kissed her then, properly this time, with all the passion and need and desperation that had been building for weeks. Margaret kissed him back, her hands fisting in his shirt, letting herself fall into it, into him, into the terrifying, beautiful possibility of love. They broke apart only when Sam stirred, murmuring in his sleep. They both turned to him immediately, checking his forehead, listening to his breathing. Still fevered, but manageable. Still sick, but healing. "You should rest," Margaret said. I'll watch him for a while." "I can't sleep." "Then lie down anyway. You're exhausted." Ethan settled on the bed beside Sam, his arm draped protectively over his son. Margaret pulled a chair close, keeping vigil over both of them. She watched Ethan's eyes drift closed despite his best efforts to stay awake, watched his breathing slow and deepen as exhaustion finally claimed him. And she thought about what had just happened. Not just Sam's illness and recovery, but what had been said. The declarations made in the raw honesty of crisis. She loved Ethan Cole. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt right, inevitable. Like something that had been true for weeks but had needed crisis to bring it into the light. She was 53 years old and in love for the second time in her life. The realization made her smile despite her exhaustion. Sam recovered slowly over the next week, his strength returning in increments. Margaret nursed him with the fierce tenderness of a mother, and somewhere along the way she stopped correcting him when he called her Miss Margaret and started letting him shorten it to just Margaret. It felt like family, that informality. It felt like belonging. Ethan worked the land with renewed purpose, preparing the fields for planting, making plans for the coming season. He and Margaret talked long into the nights about what they could grow, what repairs were most urgent, how to make the homestead not just survive, but thrive. "We could buy a few more chickens," Ethan suggested one evening. "Start selling eggs regularly in town. And maybe a pig or two," Margaret added, "for meat and to sell. We'd need to reinforce the pen. We'd need to reinforce half the place. But we could do it. Together." Ethan reached across the table and took her hand. "Together. I like the sound of that." "Me too." They were building something. Not just fixing what was broken, but creating something new, a future, a family, a life. But there was one conversation they still needed to have. It came on a Sunday evening in early April. Spring had finally, truly arrived. The snow completely melted, the grass greening, the world coming back to life. They were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, Sam playing with a stick and his wooden horse in the yard. "Margaret," Ethan said quietly, "I need to ask you something." "All right. What are we doing here? I know what I want. I want to stay. I want to build a life with you. I want to marry you if you'll have me. But I need to know what you want." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, watching Sam play, thinking about everything that had brought them to this moment. "I want that too," she said finally. "But I'm scared." "Of what?" "Of all of it. Of marriage, of being a mother again, of letting myself believe this can actually work. I'm too old for this, Ethan." "You keep saying that. You're not too old." "I am. I'm old enough to be your mother." "You're 53. I'm 36. That's 17 years, not a lifetime. And I don't care about the difference. Why should you?" "Because people will talk. Because it's not normal. Because you're looking for reasons to be afraid instead of reasons to be brave," Ethan interrupted gently. "Listen to me. I don't care about your age. I don't care what people in town think. I care about you, about us, about building something real and lasting with the woman I love. The question is, do you care enough to take that chance?" Margaret looked at him, at this good patient man who'd somehow seen past all her defenses to the scared, lonely woman underneath, who loved her anyway, who'd stayed anyway. "Yes," she said, "I care enough." "Then marry me. Make it official. Make us a family." "Just like that?" "Just like that." Margaret laughed, a sound somewhere between joy and disbelief. "You're crazy." "Probably, but I'm crazy about you." "That was terrible." "I know." He was grinning now. "But you're smiling, so it worked." Margaret shook her head, but she was smiling, actually smiling. "All right. Yes. I'll marry you, Ethan Cole, even though you're too young for me and too optimistic by half and probably going to regret this when you realize how difficult I am. I already know how difficult you are. I'm counting on it." He pulled her into his arms, kissing her soundly while Sam cheered from the yard, delighted by this development he'd been predicting for weeks. And Margaret thought, for the first time in more than a decade, that maybe the future wasn't something to fear. Maybe it was something to embrace. They decided to marry in May, when the wildflowers were in bloom and the land had finally shaken off winter's grip. No grand ceremony, no elaborate preparations, just the three of them, a circuit preacher who passed through Birch Creek once a month, and whatever witnesses they could gather from town. But first, Margaret insisted, there were things that needed to be done. "We can't bring you into this house as my husband when half the roof leaks and the barn's about to collapse," she said the morning after Ethan's proposal. "People will think I'm taking advantage of you, marrying you just to get free labor." Ethan looked up from his coffee, amused. "Aren't you?" "Absolutely, but I don't want them to know that." He laughed, the sound filling the kitchen in a way that still surprised Margaret with its warmth. "Fair enough. So we fix the place up first. Make it worthy of a wedding." "Make it worthy of a life," Margaret corrected. "A real life, not just survival. Then that's what we'll do." They threw themselves into the work with a determination that bordered on obsession. Ethan spent his days on the roof, replacing rotted shingles and reinforcing the frame. Margaret tackled the inside of the house, scrubbing years of accumulated grime from corners she'd been too tired or too defeated to clean. Sam helped where he could, fetching tools and holding boards steady, his chatter a constant backdrop to their labor. The first trip to town was harder than Margaret had anticipated. They loaded the wagon with eggs and the butter Margaret had been saving, items they could trade for supplies they'd need for the repairs. Sam bounced on the seat between them, excited for the adventure. Margaret sat rigid, her hands clasped tight in her lap. "You all right?" Ethan asked quietly. "Fine." "You don't look fine. You look like you're heading to your own hanging." Margaret glanced at him. "I haven't been to town in 6 months. The last time I went, Martha Jenkins made a comment about how I was letting myself go. Said it was a shame to see a woman give up on herself like that. Martha Jenkins sounds like a miserable old biddy. She is, but she's also the biggest gossip in 3 counties. By the time we leave town today, everyone will know about you and Sam. They'll have opinions. Let them. It's not that simple. Ethan reached over and took her hand, unclenching her fingers and lacing them with his. Yes, it is. Their opinions don't pay our bills or put food on our table. Their opinions don't keep us warm at night or make us happy, so let them talk. We know the truth. And what's the truth? That we're building something good, that we're making a family, that we deserve happiness just as much as anyone else. Margaret wanted to believe him, wanted to walk into town with her head held high and her hand in his and dare anyone to say a word. But years of isolation and criticism had left their mark. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like everyone would see right through her to the desperate, lonely woman underneath. Birch Creek was a small town, just a main street with a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a church. The Stevens Ranch supplied most of the business, their hands coming in regularly for supplies and entertainment. Margaret usually tried to time her visits for midweek when the town was quieter, but today was Saturday and the street was busy. Heads turned as they pulled up in front of the general store. Margaret could feel the stares, hear the whispers starting already. She kept her eyes forward, helping Sam down from the wagon while Ethan secured the horses. The bell above the door jangled as they entered. Walter Grant, the store owner, looked up from behind the counter, and his eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. "Margaret Holloway," he said, surprise clear in his voice. "Haven't seen you in months. Thought maybe you'd finally given up on that place of yours." Still standing, Walter, still working it. His eyes shifted to Ethan and Sam, curiosity naked on his face. "And you've got company, I see." "This is Ethan Cole and his son Sam. They're staying with me, helping with the place." The way Walter's expression changed told Margaret exactly what he was thinking. She felt heat rise in her cheeks but kept her voice steady. "We need roofing materials," she continued. "Nails, tar paper, shingles if you've got them, and seeds for the garden. Whatever you can spare." Walter nodded slowly, still studying Ethan. "That's quite a list. Got the money for it?" "We've got eggs and butter to trade, and I can pay cash for what that doesn't cover." Ethan stepped forward, his voice pleasant, but with an edge Margaret was learning to recognize. "Is there a problem, Mr. Grant?" "No problem. Just surprised is all. Margaret here doesn't usually ask for help." "I'm not asking for help," Margaret said sharply. "I'm buying supplies. Are you selling or not?" Walter held up his hands. Selling. No need to get your hackles up. I'll put together what you need." While Walter gathered their supplies, Sam wandered over to a display of penny candy, his eyes wide. Ethan followed him, one hand on the boy's shoulder, murmuring something Margaret couldn't hear. She stood at the counter, acutely aware of the other customers in the store, the way conversations had quieted, the sideways glances. The door jangled again, and Martha Jenkins walked in, her sharp eyes immediately finding Margaret. Well, she said, her voice carrying across the store. "Margaret Holloway, and looking almost human for once. To what do we owe the pleasure?" Margaret forced a smile. "Hello, Martha. Just picking up some supplies." Martha's gaze shifted to Ethan and Sam, her expression sharpening with interest. "And who might these two be? Don't tell me you've finally taken in boarders." "This is Ethan Cole and his son Sam. They're helping me with the homestead." "Helping?" Martha drew the word out, making it sound sordid. "How convenient for you. A strong young man to do the heavy lifting. Though I have to say, Margaret, people are going to talk. A widow woman living alone with a man not her husband. It's not proper." Something inside Margaret snapped. Years of biting her tongue, of enduring Martha's small cruelties and judgments, of trying to be smaller and quieter and less than she was just to avoid conflict. She was done with it. "Then let them talk, Martha. Let them talk about how I've worked this land alone for 11 years. Let them talk about how I lost my husband and both my sons and kept going anyway. Let them talk about how I opened my door to strangers in a blizzard because it was the right thing to do. And if they want to talk about impropriety, they can start with your son Robert and what he does every Saturday night at the saloon when he thinks his wife doesn't know." The store went completely silent. Martha's face turned an alarming shade of red. "How dare you?" "I dare because I'm tired, Martha. Tired of being judged by people who wouldn't last a week living my life. tired of shrinking myself to make others comfortable. So yes, Ethan and Sam are staying with me. And in case you're wondering, we're getting married in May, so you and the rest of your gossip circle can chew on that for a while. Margaret turned on her heel and walked to where Ethan stood with Sam, both of them staring at her with expressions of shock and admiration. "We're done here," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "Walter, send word when our supplies are ready. We'll pick them up next week." She walked out of the store with her head high, Ethan and Sam following. She made it all the way to the wagon before her legs started to shake. She gripped the side of the wagon bed, breathing hard. Ethan came up beside her, his hand gentle on her back. That was magnificent. That was stupid. Now everyone really will talk. Good. Let them talk about how you stood up to the town bully and put her in her place. Let them talk about how you're not afraid anymore. "I am afraid. I'm terrified." "But you did it anyway. That's what bravery is." Margaret turned to him, and to her horror, she started to cry. Not delicate tears, but great heaving sobs that shook her whole body. Ethan pulled her into his arms, holding her while she fell apart right there on Main Street in Birch Creek for everyone to see. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "I'm sorry. I don't know why." "Because you've been holding it in for years. Because you've been so busy being strong that you forgot it's okay to break sometimes. Let it out, Margaret. I've got you." Sam pressed against her side, his small arms wrapping around her waist. "It's okay, Margaret. Tears are just love with nowhere to go." That made her cry harder, but it also made her laugh. This impossible child with his impossible wisdom. She held them both, right there in the middle of town, and let herself be seen. Broken and messy and real. When she finally pulled herself together, she found several people watching from nearby storefronts, but not all the faces were judgmental. Mrs. Chen from the boarding house was smiling. Young Jacob Turner gave her a respectful nod. Even old Pete from the saloon raised his glass in what looked like a salute. Maybe not everyone in town was like Martha Jenkins. Maybe some of them understood. The ride home was quiet, but it was a comfortable quiet. Sam fell asleep against Margaret's side, worn out from the excitement. Ethan drove with one hand, his other resting on Margaret's knee, a solid, reassuring weight. "You meant what you said?" he asked finally. "About getting married in May?" "I did. If you still want to after that spectacle." "Are you kidding? I've never wanted anything more. You were incredible back there." "I was reckless." "You were honest. There's a difference." Margaret looked out at the land rolling past, the greening fields and the mountains in the distance. This hard, beautiful country that had taken so much from her, but had also given her this. A second chance, a new family, a reason to hope. "I love you," she said quietly. Ethan's hand tightened on her knee. "I love you too." The weeks that followed were some of the hardest and happiest of Margaret's life. They worked from dawn until dark, repairing and rebuilding, transforming the homestead from a place of mere survival into something that could actually thrive. Ethan proved to be not just strong but skilled, his hands capable of intricate carpentry work that transformed rough boards into tight joints and straight lines. Margaret found herself teaching him about the land in return, about which crops grew best in which soil, about reading the weather in the clouds and the wind, about the 100 small tricks she'd learned over 30 years of frontier living. They were partners in the truest sense, each bringing different strengths to the work. Sam continued his lessons, progressing so quickly that Margaret had to borrow more advanced books from the small library in town. He was bright and curious, asking questions about everything from why the sky was blue to how plants grew to where babies came from. That last question led to an awkward conversation that left both Margaret and Ethan red-faced while Sam listened with scientific interest. "So when you and Papa get married, will you make a baby?" he asked with unsettling directness. Margaret choked on her coffee. Ethan suddenly became very interested in his breakfast. "Sam," Ethan said finally, "that's not... You can't just ask people that." "Why not?" "I want a brother or a sister." "I'm too old for that," Margaret said quickly. Sam frowned. "How old is too old?" 53 is definitely too old. Mrs. Chen in town had a baby last year and she's older than you. Mrs. Chen is 42, not 53. There's a difference. But, Sam, Ethan interrupted gently, Sometimes things like that happen, and sometimes they don't. We can't control it. But whether or not we have more children, you'll always be loved and wanted. That's what matters. Sam considered this seriously. I guess that's okay, as long as I still get to be your son. Always, Margaret said, reaching across to ruffle his hair. You'll always be our son. The word slipped out naturally, but it resonated in the silence that followed. Our son. Not Ethan's son. Ours. Sam's face lit up like sunrise. Really? I can call you Ma if I want to? Margaret's throat tightened. She'd thought that door was closed forever, that she'd never again hear that word directed at her. If you want to. I want to. Sam scrambled out of his chair and threw himself at Margaret, hugging her fiercely. I love you, Ma. Margaret held him, this boy who wasn't hers by blood but was becoming hers by choice, and felt something settle into place in her heart, a space she'd thought was permanently empty filling up again. I love you too, sweetheart. When she looked up, Ethan was watching them with tears in his eyes. As May approached, they made their final preparations. The roof was sound, the barn was reinforced, the garden was planted with neat rows of vegetables that were already starting to sprout. The house had been scrubbed inside and out, the windows fixed, the floors mended. It looked like a home now, not just a shelter. Margaret even allowed herself to buy a new dress for the wedding. Nothing fancy, just a simple calico in deep blue that Ethan said made her eyes look like Montana sky. She felt foolish spending money on vanity, but when she saw how Ethan looked at her when she tried it on, the foolishness felt worth it. They set the date for May 15th. The circuit preacher confirmed he'd be in Birch Creek that week. They invited no one formally, but word had spread, and Margaret suspected they'd have more witnesses than they expected. The night before the wedding, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had changed in the past 4 months. How she'd gone from a woman who'd given up on life to a woman about to start a new one. How terrifying and exhilarating that was. There was a soft knock on her door. Margaret, you awake? She sat up. Come in. Ethan entered, still dressed, carrying a lamp. Saw your light was on. Thought you might be having second thoughts. Not second thoughts, just thoughts. He sat on the edge of her bed, setting the lamp on the bedside table. Want to share them? I'm wondering if I'm doing the right thing, not marrying you, she added quickly. I want that, but I'm wondering if it's fair to you. You could have someone younger, someone who could give you more children, someone without all my baggage. We've been over this. I know, but tomorrow it becomes real. Tomorrow I become your wife, and you become stuck with me for better or worse. Ethan took her hands in his. Listen to me very carefully. I don't want someone younger. I don't want someone different. I want you. Your strength, your stubbornness, your hard-won wisdom, your incredible capacity for love even after everything you've lost. I want your baggage because it's part of who you are, and I love who you are. All of you. Even the difficult parts? Especially the difficult parts. They make the easy parts sweeter. Margaret smiled despite herself. When did you get so wise? I learned from the best. He squeezed her hands. Are we really doing this? We're really doing this. Good, because I have something for you. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was a ring, simple silver with a small stone that caught the lamplight. It was my grandmother's, Ethan said. It's not much, but it's all I have of her. She was a lot like you, actually, tough as nails and twice as sharp. She survived 3 husbands and outlived them all out of sheer spite. Margaret laughed. Sounds like my kind of woman. I thought you'd appreciate that. Will you wear it? He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting all this time to find its way to her hand. It's beautiful, Margaret whispered. So are you. He leaned forward and kissed her, soft and slow and sweet. When he pulled back, his eyes were searching hers. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow, she agreed. After he left, Margaret sat for a long time, turning the ring on her finger, watching how it caught the light. Tomorrow she would stand before a preacher and promise to love and honor this man for the rest of her days. Tomorrow she would become someone's wife again, someone's mother again. Tomorrow she would step fully into this new life she'd been so afraid to reach for. The thought still terrified her, but it also filled her with a joy so fierce it took her breath away. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect May morning that felt like a blessing. Margaret woke early and made breakfast for her boys. She was already thinking of them that way, her boys, then went to dress while they did the same. She put on the blue dress, braided her hair, and pinned it up, and looked at herself in the small mirror that hung beside her bed. The woman looking back at her was older than the girl who'd married Thomas all those years ago, her face lined and weathered, but her eyes were alive in a way they hadn't been in more than a decade. She looked happy. The realization made her smile. They drove into town in the wagon, all three of them dressed in their Sunday best. Sam couldn't stop fidgeting with excitement, chattering about everything and nothing. Ethan was quieter, but his hand found Margaret's and held on tight. The church was small and simple, whitewashed wood with a cross above the door. Margaret expected it to be empty except for the preacher, but when they walked in, she stopped short. The pews were full. Mrs. Chen was there, beaming. Jacob Turner and several other hands from the Stevens Ranch. Walter Grant from the general store with his wife. Old Pete from the saloon, cleaned up and sober. Even young families Margaret barely knew, come to witness the union. And there in the front row sat Martha Jenkins. Her face was neutral, impossible to read, but she'd come. That meant something. The circuit preacher was a kind-faced man in his 60s named Reverend Walsh. He greeted them warmly, asking only the necessary questions to confirm they were entering into this union freely and with full understanding. Then they stood before him, Ethan's hand warm in Margaret's, Sam between them holding both their hands, and Reverend Walsh began to speak. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Margaret Holloway and Ethan Cole in holy matrimony. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly, but reverently, deliberately, and in accordance with the purposes for which it was instituted. It is a commitment to love, to work together, to build a life not in isolation, but in partnership. Margaret barely heard the words. She was too focused on Ethan's face, on the love and certainty she saw there, on the way his thumb was rubbing circles on the back of her hand. Ethan, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death parts you? I do. Ethan's voice was strong, unwavering. Margaret, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death parts you? Margaret looked at Ethan, at Sam, at this future she'd been so afraid to claim. I do. Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. Ethan pulled her close and kissed her thoroughly, to cheers and applause from the assembled witnesses. When they broke apart, both breathless and grinning, Sam was jumping up and down with excitement. We're a family now, he shouted. A real family. We were always a real family, Margaret said, pulling him into a hug. But now it's official. The congregation erupted in congratulations. People Margaret barely knew pressed forward to shake their hands, to wish them well, to offer advice and blessings. Even Martha Jenkins approached, her expression softening in a way Margaret had never seen. You did good, Margaret, she said quietly. He's a good man, and that boy of his is lucky to have you. Thank you, Martha. That means more than you know. Martha nodded, then leaned in closer. And for what it's worth, I'm sorry. For the things I said. You were right. I had no business judging you. We all do the best we can with what we have, Margaret said. Let's just move forward from here. They shook hands, and Margaret felt another weight lift from her shoulders. Forgiveness, it turned out, was lighter than resentment. Outside the church, in the bright May sunshine, Ethan swept Margaret into his arms and spun her around, both of them laughing like children. Sam danced around them, whooping with joy, and Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten what it was like. Pure, uncomplicated happiness. They drove home as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. Sam fell asleep on the seat between them, exhausted from the day's excitement. Mrs. Cole, Ethan said softly, testing out the name. That sounds strange. You'll get used to it. Will I? Eventually. He glanced at her. Any regrets? Margaret looked at the ring on her finger, at her sleeping son, at her husband beside her, at the land spreading out before them in the fading light, at this life she'd been brave enough to choose. Not a single one, she said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. Their first night as husband and wife was quiet and tender, filled with a nervousness that seemed absurd given everything they'd already been through together. Ethan carried her over the threshold of her own house, their house now, while Sam clapped and cheered. They put the boy to bed together, both of them tucking him in, kissing his forehead, whispering goodnight. Then they stood in the doorway of Margaret's bedroom, both suddenly shy. I can sleep in the other room if you need more time, Ethan offered quietly. Margaret took his hand. We're married now. Time for pretending is over. They learned each other slowly that night, with patience and care and a tenderness that brought tears to Margaret's eyes. It had been so long since she'd been touched with love, since she'd allowed herself to be vulnerable with another person. Ethan was gentle with her scarred body and scarred heart, treating both as precious things worth cherishing. Afterward, lying in his arms in the darkness, Margaret felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for 11 years. Thank you, she whispered. For what? For being patient with me. For not giving up even when I gave you every reason to. Ethan kissed her forehead. You're worth the patience, Margaret Cole. You're worth everything. She fell asleep listening to his heartbeat, steady and strong, a rhythm she could count on. The next months brought changes both subtle and profound. The homestead transformed under their combined efforts. The garden flourished, producing more vegetables than Margaret had managed in years. Ethan built a proper chicken coop that kept the foxes out, and their flock doubled. They bought 2 pigs from a neighboring ranch, and Ethan reinforced the pen just as they'd planned. But the changes went deeper than just improvements to the land. The house filled with life in ways Margaret had forgotten were possible. Sam's laughter echoing off the walls. Ethan's off-key humming as he worked. The sound of 2 voices calling her name instead of just the wind. She'd grown so used to silence that sometimes the noise overwhelmed her, and she'd have to step outside just to breathe. But even then, she found herself smiling at the sound of it, at the proof that she was no longer alone. They developed routines. Ethan would wake first and start the coffee while Margaret dressed. She'd make breakfast while he brought in water from the well. Sam would stumble out sleepy-eyed and climb into his father's lap until he was awake enough to eat. After breakfast, they'd divide up the day's work, coming back together for the midday meal, then working until supper. Evenings were for lessons with Sam, for mending and planning, for sitting together by the fire. It was ordinary and domestic and utterly unremarkable. It was the most beautiful thing Margaret had ever known. But life on the frontier was never easy for long. The first real test came in late June when a summer storm rolled in with unusual fury. Margaret had seen the signs in the sky that morning, the greenish tint to the clouds, the way the air felt heavy and electric. She knew what was coming. We need to get the animals secured, she told Ethan. This is going to be bad. They worked quickly, getting the chickens locked in the coop, the pigs into the barn, Patience into her stall. Sam helped carry supplies, his face serious with the understanding that this was important. By the time the first drops fell, they were all inside the house, watching through the windows as the storm built. The wind came first, bending the trees nearly horizontal. Then the rain, so hard it sounded like gravel hitting the roof. Lightning split the sky in jagged white lines, thunder following so close it shook the walls. Sam pressed against Margaret's side, his small body trembling. "It's all right," she murmured, wrapping her arm around him. "The house is strong. We're safe." But even as she said it, she heard a crack like a gunshot. Through the window, she saw one of the old cottonwoods at the edge of the property, split down the middle, half of it crashing to the ground. "If that had hit the barn," Ethan started. "It didn't. We're lucky." The storm raged for 2 hours. When it finally passed, leaving an eerie calm in its wake, they ventured outside to assess the damage. The fallen cottonwood had missed the barn by maybe 20 feet. The garden had been battered, several plants torn up by the wind, but most had survived. The chicken coop was intact. The house had held, but the well had collapsed. Margaret stared at the pile of stones and broken wood where their water source had been, feeling her stomach drop. Without the well, they had nothing. No water for drinking, cooking, bathing, or watering the garden. The nearest creek was a mile away, and hauling water that distance every day would be backbreaking work. "We can rebuild it," Ethan said, though his voice was tight with worry. "That'll take weeks, and money we don't have for the materials. Then we'll borrow, or we'll trade, or we'll haul water until we can rebuild. We'll figure it out, Margaret." She wanted to snap at him, wanted to rage at the unfairness of it, at how every time they got ahead something knocked them back down. But she looked at his face and saw the same frustration she felt, tempered with determination. He wasn't dismissing the problem, he was choosing to face it. So she took a breath and nodded. "You're right. We'll figure it out." They spent the next week hauling water from the creek in barrels loaded onto the wagon. It was grueling work, especially in the summer heat. Margaret's back ached constantly, her hands blistered from the rope. Even Sam helped, carrying smaller buckets that sloshed and spilled, but every little bit counted. On the 5th day, Jacob Turner rode up with 4 other hands from the Stevens ranch. They climbed down from their horses, tools in hand. "Heard you had some trouble with your well," Jacob said. Margaret stared at them. "How did you hear that?" "Mrs. Chen mentioned it when I was in town. Figured you could use some help." "I can't pay you." "Didn't ask you to. You gave me shelter when I needed it. Time to return the favor." The men worked for 3 days, digging out the collapsed well, reinforcing the walls with stone, building a new frame for the bucket. Margaret fed them the best meals she could manage, using up her precious stores without hesitation. Ethan worked alongside them, learning their techniques, his respect for these rough men growing with each hour. When they finished, the well was deeper and stronger than it had been before. "Should last you another 30 years, Jacob said, wiping sweat from his forehead. Margaret didn't know what to say. She'd spent so long isolated, convinced that asking for help was weakness, that accepting it was admitting defeat. But these men had come without being asked, had given their time and labor freely, had made her problem their problem. "Thank you," she managed, her voice thick. "I don't know how to repay you." "Don't need repayment. Just remember it next time someone else needs help. That's how we survive out here. Together." After they left, Margaret stood by the well, running her hand over the new stonework. Ethan came up beside her, slipping his arm around her waist. "You were right," she said quietly. "About what?" "About not everyone being like Martha Jenkins. About there being good people in this world. Took you long enough to see it." She leaned into him. "I'm a slow learner." "But you get there eventually. That's what matters." As summer turned to fall, the homestead continued to flourish. Their first real harvest was better than Margaret had dared hope. The garden produced bushels of vegetables that they canned and stored for winter. The chickens laid so many eggs that they had plenty to sell in town. The pigs grew fat and healthy. They were still far from wealthy, but for the first time in years, Margaret wasn't worried about surviving the winter. Sam started proper school in September, riding into Birch Creek 3 days a week with the Stevens ranch hands who passed by their property. He came home each day bubbling with stories about his lessons, about the other children, about his teacher, Miss Peterson, who said he was the brightest student she'd had in years. "She says I should think about going to university someday," Sam announced one evening at dinner. "Says I've got the mind for it." Margaret and Ethan exchanged glances. "University costs money, buddy," Ethan said carefully. "A lot of money." "I know, but I've got years to save up, right? And maybe I could get a scholarship or something. Miss Peterson says they give those to smart kids sometimes." Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. "If you want to go to university, we'll find a way to make it happen. I promise you that." "Really? Really? Your mama would want you to have every opportunity. So do we." Sam's eyes shone. "I'm going to make you proud. Both of you." "You already do," Ethan said, his voice rough with emotion. "Every single day." That winter was easier than any Margaret could remember. They had food stored, firewood stacked, the house sealed tight against the cold. When storms came, they weathered them together, playing cards by the fire, Ethan teaching Sam to carve wood, Margaret reading aloud from the books Sam brought home from school. It was during one of those long winter evenings that Margaret realized something had changed in her. She was sitting in her chair with her mending, watching Ethan help Sam with a particularly tricky piece of carving, and she felt it. A lightness in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. She was happy, not just content or surviving or making do, actually genuinely happy. The realization made her pause, needle hovering over fabric. When had that happened? When had the weight she'd carried for so long finally lifted? She couldn't pinpoint an exact moment. It had been gradual, accumulated through months of shared meals and morning coffee and quiet conversations, through Ethan's steady presence and Sam's bright laughter, through the simple, revolutionary act of letting herself be loved. "You okay over there?" Ethan asked, noticing her stillness. Margaret smiled. "More than okay. I was just thinking." "About what?" "About how strange life is. How a year ago I was alone in this house, convinced I'd die that way. And now," she gestured around the room, at her husband and son, at the warmth and life filling every corner. "Now I have this." "Any regrets?" "Not a single one." Spring came again, the land greening and coming alive. On a mild April morning, Margaret woke to find Ethan already awake, propped up on one elbow, watching her. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "Just looking at you. My wife. Still can't quite believe you're real sometimes." "I'm real. Cranky and aging and very real." "You're not aging, you're just gaining experience." Margaret snorted. "That's a diplomatic way of saying I'm getting old." "You're not old. You're seasoned. Like a cast iron skillet." "Exactly. And everyone knows those are the most valuable kind." She laughed, swatting at him. He caught her hand and pulled her close, kissing her until she forgot what they'd been talking about. Later, over breakfast, Sam made an announcement. "Miss Peterson says there's a territorial fair in Helena in June. She wants to take some of her best students. Can I go?" "Helena's 3 days' ride from here," Ethan said. "I know, but she says it's educational. They have exhibits on science and agriculture and all sorts of things, and there's a competition for students, essays and mathematics and stuff. She thinks I could win." Margaret looked at her son, because he was her son now, in every way that mattered, and saw the eagerness in his face, the hunger for more than this small corner of Montana could offer. "Of course you can go," she said. "We'll make sure you have everything you need." "Really? You're not worried about the cost or the danger or—" "I'm worried about all of those things. But I'm more worried about clipping your wings because I'm afraid to let you fly." Sam threw his arms around her neck. "Thank you, Ma. You're the best." After he ran outside to do his morning chores, Ethan reached across the table and took Margaret's hand. "That was hard for you," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Terrifying. What if something happens to him? What if—" "We can't live in the what-ifs. We learned that the hard way, both of us. We have to let him live his life." "When did you get so wise?" "I told you. I learned from the best." The weeks leading up to the fair were a flurry of preparation. Margaret helped Sam work on his essay, a piece about the importance of education in frontier communities. Ethan gave him money from their carefully saved surplus, enough for food and lodging and a little extra just in case. They packed his bag together, Margaret slipping in extra socks and a letter telling him how proud they were. The morning Sam left with Miss Peterson and 3 other students, Margaret stood on the porch watching the wagon disappear down the road, tears streaming down her face. "He's coming back," Ethan said gently, his arm around her shoulders. "I know, but he's also growing up. Soon he won't need us anymore." "He'll always need us, just in different ways." Sam was gone for 2 weeks. They were the longest 2 weeks of Margaret's life. She threw herself into work, but everything felt empty without his chatter, his questions, his presence. She'd grown so used to being a mother again that his absence left a hole she couldn't fill. When the wagon finally appeared on the horizon, Margaret dropped the basket of eggs she was carrying and ran. Sam jumped down before it had fully stopped, waving a blue ribbon triumphantly. "I won!" he shouted. "I won 3rd place in the essay competition, out of 67 students." Margaret hugged him so hard he complained he couldn't breathe. She didn't care. Her boy had gone out into the world and come back successful and safe and still hers. That night, Sam told them everything about the fair. The exhibits he'd seen, the people he'd met, the ideas that were changing the world. He talked about electric lights and steam engines and telephones that could carry voices across wires. He talked about universities and laboratories and discoveries waiting to be made. Margaret listened, her heart swelling with pride and breaking with the knowledge that someday, probably sooner than she wanted, this bright boy would outgrow this small homestead and need to find his place in that larger world. But not yet. For now, he was still hers. The years that followed settled into a rhythm. Seasons passed, each one bringing its own challenges and triumphs. The homestead grew more prosperous as word spread about Margaret and Ethan's fair dealing. People started stopping by for advice on farming techniques, for help with sick animals, for a meal and conversation. The once lonely house became a gathering place. Margaret started teaching other children who lived too far from town to attend school regularly. 3 afternoons a week, her kitchen table was surrounded by young faces, eager for learning. She discovered she had a talent for teaching, a patience she hadn't known she possessed. Ethan expanded their livestock, adding cattle to their holdings. It meant more work, but also more security. They hired help during busy seasons, giving work to men who needed it, paying fair wages, building relationships throughout the territory. Sam grew tall and strong, his 14th birthday arriving with the startling realization that he was nearly a man. He still helped with the homestead work, but his real passion was his studies. He devoured every book he could find, corresponding with his teachers, preparing for the future he was beginning to see clearly. One evening, shortly after his 15th birthday, Sam came to Margaret and Ethan with a serious expression. "I need to talk to you both about something." They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where they'd shared so many meals, so many conversations. "Miss Peterson has arranged for me to take the entrance examinations for the University of Montana," Sam said. "If I pass, I could start next fall. They have a scholarship program for promising students. She thinks I could qualify." Margaret's heart clenched. She'd known this was coming, had been preparing herself for it, but the reality still hit hard. "What do you want to do?" Ethan asked quietly. "I want to go. I want to study. I want to learn everything I can and then come back here and use that knowledge to help people, to make things better." "Then you should go," Margaret said, forcing the words past the lump in her throat. "But I don't want to leave you. You've done so much for me. I owe you." "You don't owe us anything," Ethan interrupted. "We're your parents. Helping you become the man you're meant to be isn't something you owe us for. It's our privilege." "But the homestead will be fine," Margaret said firmly. "We'll manage, we always do. What we won't be fine with is you sacrificing your future out of some misplaced sense of obligation." Sam's eyes were bright with tears. "I love you both so much." "We love you too, sweetheart. That's why we're letting you go." Sam took the examinations in June and passed with scores high enough to earn a full scholarship. He would leave in September for Missoula, a city that might as well have been on the other side of the world for how far it felt from the homestead. The summer was bittersweet. Margaret tried to memorize everything about him, the sound of his laugh, the way he hummed while he worked, the serious expression he got when reading. She knew he'd come back for visits, that he wasn't lost to her forever. But things would never be quite the same. The day he left, half the county seemed to turn out to see him off. The wagon was loaded with his belongings, letters of recommendation from his teachers, and enough food to last a week. Margaret had spent the previous night baking, unable to sleep, needing to do something with her hands. "Remember to write," she said, holding him tight. "Every week." "I will. I promise. And eat properly. Don't just live on bread and coffee." "I won't. And if you need anything at all, Ma." Sam pulled back, his hands on her shoulders. "I'll be fine. You taught me how to survive. Both of you did." Ethan shook his son's hand, then pulled him into a hug. "Make us proud, son." "I will. I promise." Margaret watched the wagon carry her son away, the same way she'd watched him leave for the fair 2 years earlier. But this time felt different, final in a way the other hadn't been. "He's really gone," she whispered. Ethan's arm came around her. "He'll be back. For Christmas, for summers. He's not gone forever." "I know, but our boy is leaving and a man is going in his place. That's what we raised him for. To be strong enough to leave." Margaret leaned into her husband, letting herself grieve this change even as she celebrated it. This was what love looked like, she realized. Letting go when holding on would be easier, choosing someone else's happiness over your own comfort. That winter was quiet without Sam, but it wasn't empty. Margaret and Ethan grew closer, rediscovering each other without the buffer of daily parenting. They talked more, laughed more, found new rhythms in their days. True to his word, Sam wrote every week. Long letters detailing his classes, his professors, his new friends. He was thriving, his mind expanding in ways the homestead never could have provided. Margaret read his letters aloud to Ethan by the fire, both of them glowing with pride. He came home for Christmas, bringing with him stories and books and a new confidence. But he also brought something else: gratitude. For the sacrifice they'd made to send him, for the home they'd given him, for the love that had saved him when his mother died. "I wouldn't be here without you," he told Margaret on Christmas Eve. "Either of you. You gave me a reason to keep living when I'd forgotten how." "You did the same for us," Margaret said. "You reminded us what it meant to have a family." Years continued to pass, measured in harvests and seasons, in letters from Sam and visits home. He graduated from university with honors, then shocked them by announcing he was staying in Missoula to teach. "I want to do for other kids what you did for me," he explained. "Give them opportunities they wouldn't have otherwise." Margaret couldn't have been prouder. Sam married at 23, a kind young woman named Elizabeth who reminded Margaret of herself, practical, strong, with a sharp mind and sharper tongue. They had their first child a year later, a daughter they named Sarah Margaret. And suddenly Margaret was a grandmother. She held her granddaughter for the first time with tears streaming down her face. This tiny, perfect miracle that existed because she'd been brave enough to open her door during a snowstorm 7 years earlier. "You're doing it again," Ethan teased gently. "Doing what?" "Crying." "I'm old. I'm allowed to cry." "You're not old. You're seasoned, remember?" Margaret laughed through her tears. At 60, she felt ancient and ageless all at once. Her hair was completely white now, her hands gnarled with arthritis. But her heart was full in a way it had never been, even in her youth. The homestead had grown beyond anything she'd imagined. What had once been 40 struggling acres was now 200 thriving ones, with cattle, crops, and a reputation for quality throughout the territory. They'd built a second house on the property for hired help and their families. The land that had nearly killed her with loneliness now supported a dozen people. But it was more than just the land. The house itself had become a hub of community. They hosted harvest celebrations, winter gatherings, quilting bees. Margaret taught reading to anyone who wanted to learn, regardless of age. Ethan mentored young men in ranching and carpentry. They'd built not just a life, but a legacy. On a warm evening in late summer, Margaret and Ethan sat on the porch watching the sunset. It had become their ritual, this quiet time together at the end of each day. Margaret was 70 now, Ethan 53, the same age she'd been when they met. The symmetry amused her. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Marrying an old woman? Missing out on years you could have had with someone younger?" Ethan took her weathered hand in his. "Not for a single second. You gave me a second chance at happiness. You gave Sam a mother when he needed one most. You gave me more than I ever dared hope for. I think I got the better end of this deal. Then we both got exactly what we needed." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to purple. From the house behind them came the sound of laughter. Sam and Elizabeth and little Sarah had come for a visit, and the place rang with the noise of family. Margaret thought about the woman she'd been 17 years ago, bitter, lonely, convinced her life was over. She thought about how close she'd come to turning Ethan and Sam away that night, how different everything would be if she had. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan asked. "About storms, about how sometimes the things we think will destroy us actually save us." Poetic. "I have my moments." He squeezed her hand. "Yes, you do." As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, they continued to sit, two people who'd found each other against all odds, who'd built something beautiful from broken pieces, who'd learned that love didn't have an age limit or an expiration date. Margaret had spent 11 years believing her story was over, that she'd used up all her chances at happiness. But sitting here now, surrounded by family, with her husband's hand warm in hers and her granddaughter's laughter floating through the open windows, she understood the truth. Her story hadn't ended when Thomas died or when her sons were taken from her. It had simply been waiting, waiting for a storm, waiting for a knock on the door, waiting for the courage to open it. Love hadn't come early for Margaret Holloway Cole. It hadn't come when she was young and smooth-skinned and full of easy hope. It had come when she was weathered and worn, when she'd forgotten how to want it, when she'd least expected it. But it had come exactly when she was ready for it. And that made all the difference. Inside the house, Sarah called for her grandmother. Margaret rose, Ethan standing with her, his hand still holding hers. Together they walked toward the light and noise and love, toward the family they'd built, toward the life they'd chosen. And Margaret thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that sometimes the best things in life are worth waiting for, worth fighting for, worth believing in, even when belief feels impossible. She'd survived everything Montana could throw at her. She'd outlasted grief and loneliness and despair, and in the end, she'd found something she thought was lost forever. She'd found home, not in a place, but in people, in family, in love. And that was worth every hard year, every bitter winter, every moment of doubt. It was worth everything.